Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Improving Policy Narratives for Young Black Workers. My name is Dr. Kayla C. Elliott, and I'm the Director of Workforce Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, America's Black think tank. We use an evidence-based research analysis, convenings, and strategic communications in economic, workforce, and tech policies, Heal Diversity, and the Black Talent Initiative to support Black communities and a network of our allies. The Workforce Policy Program centers Black workers in policy debates concerning the future of work, workforce development, and access to good jobs. Before I introduce the Joint Center's presidents, I have a couple of housekeeping items to share with you. You should all have the press release and full PowerPoint for this project in your inboxes now. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to send us your questions via the chat at any time throughout today's presentation. And if you hear something that you'd like to share on social media, please use hashtag Young Black Workers and hashtag Shift the Narrative. We'll drop those in the chat now. Now, I'd like to introduce the Joint Center's president, Deidre Asante Muhammad, who will talk about the project objective and why it's important that the Joint Center focus on young Black workers. Deidre.
Good morning, everyone. Like Kayla mentioned, one focus of the Workforce Policy Program is the future of Black workers. So it made sense for our organization to want to amplify the voices and experiences of young Black workers, who are the future, to try to change the narrative of how they are perceived in the workplace. When we launched this project, the objective was to transform the narratives about young Black people entering or navigating the workforce and identify the key messages that would lead to policy changes that help thrive and reposition them in a public sphere as assets. We hope you can help us do that. We developed a narrative change framework and messaging elements that centers young Black workers, engages key audiences, and informs future communities. Narrative change is an important part of driving policy change. By transforming the narratives that drive national public policy solutions around economic justice, we can transform the necessary systems and policies and help young Black workers thrive. New narratives can only make their way into discourse and into law through repetition, research, and action. We need an echo that reverberates through policy, advocacy, media, and philanthropy. Today's webinar is the catalyst for our echo chamber. We have a number of partners in the room working with young Black workers who are going to help us spread the message. But I want to acknowledge and thank Senator LaFonza Butler, who recently launched the Youth Advisory Council, keeping her promise to fight for the next generation and empower young people to participate in their democracy. She recorded remarks for us about her new initiative. Let's listen.
Good morning, Joint Center. To your allies, your partners, and everyone participating in this morning's webinar, good morning. I am so sorry to not be able to be joining you all live, but I couldn't miss the opportunity to kick off this great session. You know, as there is so much that is happening in the spaces concerning Black communities and Black workers, the work that you all are doing and contributing is incredibly impactful. It's really one of the reasons why I started my Youth Advisory Council. The fact that there are so many young leaders across California and across our country who are counting on leaders today to do the work and make decisions today to improve the lives of those who will be living here and carrying them forward tomorrow. This Youth Advisory Council is about 30 members, young leaders across California. They are from every corner of our state, from all walks of life, but they are centered in my office and the work that we do, really to help make sure that I live out the commitment that you do every single day, centering the voices of the future so that we make decisions today with their futures in mind. And I am excited about the work that you are going to do today, the work that you have been doing, and the work that we will do in the days and weeks and months to come, that we'll do together to continue to improve the lives of Black families and Black workers, Black communities across the country, and build that multi-generational, multicultural allyship that is going to be required for us to win. Thank you all so very much, and have a wonderful webinar.
Thanks so much to Senator Butler and her team. for bringing us greetings and for the awesome work they're doing to center young Black workers. I'd like to introduce Justin Nally, Senior Policy Analyst on our Workforce Policy team, who will go over the methodology and findings for this project. Justin.
Thank you, Kayla. Good morning, everyone. Happy to share our methodology and findings with you all. We brought together 11 young people with four-year college degrees working 40 hours a week in entry to mid-level professional roles to form the Joint Center Black Youth Worker Task Force. The task force informed and guided our narrative and communications work. There were 5 sessions with the Black Youth Worker Task Force, 1 listening session, 2 discussions on narratives, 1 communication strategy session, and a comparable campaigns audit, where we studied 11 pieces of media with varying formats concerning work and economic issues. We also did a media scan, which included 55 news articles, reports, and press releases discussing young Black workers. Additionally, we had 2 focus groups where we spoke with 14 participants about their experiences with work, including how they're perceived at work, how they make decisions to present themselves in work settings, and whether common media narratives about young Black workers rang true for them. The comparable audit takeaways include Black workers, young Black workers, Latino workers, or young LGBT workers are harmed by systemic discrimination. The dominant narrative was that these workers have been failed by policy and the institutions that they work for. For the media scan, we examined 38 articles that mention young Black workers and 17 articles that mention Black workers, and we asked ourselves, does this article mention systemic discrimination that Black workers face and or offer a systemic explanation for the status of young Black workers? We also considered the tone, specifically with respect to Black workers. Was the tone positive, negative, or neutral? Of the positive media mentions, which made up 11%, this included disparities that Black workers face, but also portrayed Black workers as people of agency and advocating for their labor rights or creating inclusive workspaces. The neutral media mention, which were 29%, included disparities that Black workers face, but also names the driving external forces in close proximity to the mention of Black workers. The negative media mentions, which were 60%, mainly identified Black workers by the disparities they face without naming the driving external forces within the same section. We've also found that more than half of all the media we reviewed mentioned the unemployment rate of young Black workers, mostly comparing it to other racial groups to demonstrate that Black workers are more likely to be unemployed. The second most mentioned topic was labor rights. It usually was mentioned with respect to unionization and observations that Black workers fare better when they belong to a union. The data analysis and workforce trends were the predominant type of content for media concerning young Black workers. Most media pieces used a negative tone to describe young Black workers. Overwhelmingly, the content focused on the unemployment rate of these young Black workers rather than the labor market conditions or the systemic conditions leading to this pattern. The media often mentioned the plight of Black workers in the context of all workers, but without the systemic context. Shifting now to the focus group findings, we have 4 main takeaways, which include bias and anti-Blackness in the workplace. Young people express the pressure of having to navigate pervasive anti-Black narratives and stereotypes. Participants express being viewed as not educated enough or not knowledgeable, too ambitious, difficult to communicate with, lazy, and not capable. Many participants reported that their workplace counterparts view them as too demanding, difficult to relate to, or not knowledgeable enough. Our second takeaway, qualified is enough. Young Black workers report that they often must exceed which would be reasonable qualifications for the roles that they seek, with participants feeling the weight of having to be overqualified for jobs. Next, professionalism centers whiteness. Even when young Black workers gain much coveted positions across industries, they report having to negotiate white-aligned dominant work culture to stay in their jobs and advance to higher positions. And finally, the need to redefine excellence. When viewed positively, the definition of Black excellence points to the high level of achievement, success, or ability demonstrated by Black individuals or communities. Most participants agreed that Black excellence can also be toxic and pervasive when it comes to young Black workers, and several participants expressed a desire to relieve that pressure. This concludes our methodology and findings. I will turn the discussion back over to Kayla.
Thanks, Justin. And a huge thanks to you and all of our colleagues and consultants who helped to get that work done and ensure that this work and the messaging that we're promoting here is informed by research and evidence. As Deidre mentioned, we were also informed by a Black Youth Worker Task Force, and we'll now hear from two of the task force members, Sierra Baker, a full-time nonprofit employee, and Evan Wayne Marlborough, who works in education, advocacy, and policy. They'll walk us through the 13 messaging elements that are informed by research-backed principles and best practices. These messaging elements emphasize racial justice and can be used to develop strong and cohesive narratives in a broad range of contexts. Sierra and Evan.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. Let's start with messaging element number 1, which reads, address the connections between racial divisions and economic hardship. Young Black people and Black communities are not vulnerable. They are strong, resilient communities who have been targeted, attacked, exploited, and systemically blocked from resources and opportunities. Messaging element number 2, unite under the notion that racism is a tool to divide us all. Acknowledge the ways racism is embedded both historically and currently in the American workforce and other systems. Name racial scapegoating or deliberate divisions as a tool villains use to profit, harming us all. And I would also like to briefly add, oftentimes implicit bias that employers display is the cause for young Black workers to not be afforded the same opportunities that other races or ethnicities are. It's unfortunate because young Black workers who show up in those spaces that look like me are turned away before they get a chance to properly advocate for themselves, which prevents young people of color from getting experience through internships, extra job opportunities, etc. Now we will move on into messaging element number 3, which reads, explicitly connect racial and economic justice. Reiterate the interconnectedness of racial and economic justice helps people see to build economic power for young Black people, we have to tackle both. Messaging element number 4. Trace the history of systemic injustice and connect individual stories to systemic injustice rather than blaming individuals. When announcing new data or new statistics about young Black workers, tell the story of how economic systems came about as a result of racism and a history of exclusion, discrimination, and disinvestment. And now we will go over messaging element number 5, lead with shared values. Shared values are points of agreement among different audiences, and shared goals will resonate with target audiences, tap into their emotions, and motivate them to act. Finding common ground is really important, but can be very difficult when certain topics of conversation are being discussed. However, learning to be comfortable during uncomfortable conversations is the first step to bridging the gap. Going into spaces with this knowledge allows for open dialogue rather than debate. We will now hear from Evan, who will discuss the next few messaging elements.
Thank you, Sierra, and good morning to everyone. So I'll be picking up from messaging elements number 6 on. So if we start with number 6, contextualize the problems facing young Black workers. The challenges that young Black workers navigate are a threat to shared values, shared prosperity because of structural racism. Young Black workers are oftentimes under a microscope. We are expected to be excellent, which is historical pressure of being Black in the workplace. We are trying to move away from being labeled a diversity hire or constantly having to prove that we are worthy of being in these spaces, which then leads us to messaging element number 7, defining who are the villains or economic bad actors who have led to the current conditions faced by young Black workers. So we need to be specific about the actions of these villains and predators who hurt everyday people and our economic well-being. And then we need to move to telling stories that promotes system-level change rather than individual-level change. So communities over people, using individual stories as windows into greater societal challenges, making connections between the systems that people must navigate and the difficult choices they have to make because of it. So now I will transition back to Sierra, who will be discussing messaging elements number 9 and 10. Sierra.
Thank you, Evan. Messaging element number 9 is tie policy solutions to shared prosperity. Emphasize how policies that empower and materially support young Black workers benefit everyone to boost broad support. And messaging element number 10, focus on asset-based framing. When referring to young Black people, as well as poor people and working families, talk about all the ways they contribute to our economy and communities. And really quickly, I would like to add, asset-based framing is essential to this process because it forces others to have a positive viewpoint about people of color. Viewing people of color as contributors instead of a burden can create a new perspective and lead to a new initiative. I'm going to pass it back to Evan again, who will finish this part of our presentation.
Thank you, Sierra. So as we move to messaging element number 11, which is offering well-rounded portraits of young Black people in every group and social Black background. So we want to show the complexity of their character outside of paid labor, the range of emotions they experience, the scope of their ambitions, and the richness of their relationships to destigmatize them, humanize the issue, and build empathy. We are a very vibrant and diverse tapestry of culture, language, and approaches to life. So when employers typecast everybody under only a Black umbrella, they group us all together in one set of stereotypes, strengths, and weaknesses. When they do assume we are all the same, they leave a lot of undiscovered talents on the table, which leads to element number 12, including the voices of those closest to the issue. So that includes looking for ways to make space for young Black people to speak authentically and have a seat at the table, something the Joint Center did amazingly with our task force. And then going into messaging element number 13, focus on the stories of young Black workers, not just the numbers. And that really speaks to humanizing widespread social problems by putting faces, names, and stories to them. Statistics are useful for demonstrating the prevalence of a problem, but stories are what trigger empathy, cooperation, and memory, and move people to address the problem. You know, as Black people, we are sometimes forced to be spokespeople for our entire race, when some of us are not comfortable about talking about the Black perspective on behalf of others because we are not all the same. And we don't all have the same experiences because our skin color is similar. We are a full diaspora. There are Black workers who come from the Caribbean or from Caribbean families who have specific sets of needs. Black workers who come from the African continent who have a specific set of needs, and Black workers who come from the United States of America who have a specific set of needs, right? Understanding and platforming and embracing the broad tapestry of Black faces in our workplaces can go a long way in expanding opportunities for Black people and all Americans. And those are the 13 elements. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sierra and Evan. To underscore the importance of narrative change and pursuing policies that center young Black workers, we've invited Satra Taylor, who's Director of Higher Education and Workforce at Young Invincibles, and Wisdom Cole, who's Director of Youth and College Division at NAACP, to join us. After this, we'll move to the Q&A portion, so please feel free to drop questions in the chat at any time. Welcome to Wisdom and Satra.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome.
Excited to be here.
Yeah. Now we go way back. So I'm super excited to have both of y'all on to talk with us about young Black workers. So let's start with Satra. How about you share a little bit about Young Invincibles as a youth-led advocacy organization? How do you all train and engage youth to be a part of shifting narratives on themselves as workers?
Thank you, Kayla, for that question. And thank you to the Joint Center for having me today for this webinar. I want to briefly touch on who we are as Young Invincibles as an organization, to talk a little bit more about our young adult programming. So for those of you who do not know, Young Invincibles is one of the nation's largest young adult advocacy and policy organizations, whose whole mission is to amplify the voices of young adults in the political process toward economic prosperity. Though we are headquartered in Washington, D.C., where I am located, we also have regions in California, Colorado, Illinois, New York, and Texas. And within each of our regions, we have what we call a Young Advocates program. And what we try to do is be very intentional about including young adults in every aspect of our work. So with the Young Advocates program that we created, it is a 12-week paid leadership program. And I emphasize paid because we have to pay young adults for their expertise like we do anyone else. But in addition to this being a paid leadership program, it's also a skills development program. And we bring in the young adults and support them with developing skills and gaining expertise in the core functions of advocacy and public policy work, and building their overall professional skills. So though we are absolutely benefiting because they are helping us develop our policies, they are also receiving benefits as well. Now, we also have what we call storytelling. And so we provide in-depth storytelling training to inform the young adults on how narrative shifting works, which is why I'm excited for this conversation. But we also talk about the importance of narrative shifting and how young adults can authentically and comfortably share their experiences. So that is our Young Advocates program. We also have a youth advisory board, and in particular for the Washington, D.C. office, we have a national youth advisory board that inform and guide most of our policy recommendations. And so the National Youth Advisory Board is a broad, diverse group of individuals, ages 18 to 34. So I should have said that at the beginning. When we at Young Invincibles, when we talk about young adults, we're referring to ages 18 through 34. But the individuals in the National Youth Advisory Board weigh in on YI's work and strategies for engaging with young adults. And board members also share how our federal work resonates in their states. And this has been crucial to my work at the federal level because I try to align priorities with what's moving in the states, because we know implementation, that's where it happens. But in general, all of the young people we work with are extremely passionate and deeply want to see change happen. So I want to, first of all, demystify any connotations or assumptions that young adults are disengaged or that young adults do not know what solutions they want to see, because they do. We just have to meet them where they are and provide them with the resources that they need to succeed. But continually, the young adults have exceeded our expectations, and they are hungry to engage with those that are in power.
I was like taking notes because I love that you said demystify, right? Like there is this like ethos or this like narrative in the ethos that young people are tapped out, that they're not concerned, that they're not involved in political or policy processes. So thank you really for centering that, right? And being at an organization that makes sure to know that not only are young folks and young workers very concerned about what's happening to them, they're concerned about what's happening to the country and the world overall, right? And giving them the training that they need there. Love that. So Wisdom, the NAACP is a membership organization. How does the Youth and College Division work to level up the concerns and narratives you hear from young Black workers and members in the broader or the organization's broader work?
Yeah, great question. Well, one, thank you, Kayla, so much for inviting me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I feel like these are conversations that me and Satra have all the time, even in our work around student debt cancellation. So shout out to you, Satra, for being at that rally this morning. But to talk about the NAACP Youth and College Division, we serve over 30,000 members across the nation who are under the age of 25, who are engaged in the fight for civil rights. That means building new units. That means training new advocates. That means making sure they're equipped with tools to meet with their elected officials, as well as ensuring that they understand the mechanics of civic engagement. You know, this past weekend, we actually finished up our Fired Up Youth Civic Leadership Summit, where we actually brought 20 young Black leaders from across the nation who are in key priority states that are engaged in turning out the Black vote and giving them all the skills from A to Z in terms of civic engagement. This was an all expense paid trip. Following this trip, some of them will be hired on as democracy fellows. Many of them will be hired on as virtual organizers. And wanting to make sure that they understand that this is not just a moment, but it's a movement, right? This is an opportunity for folks to take these skills and make it a career by working on their campuses, by working in their communities, by making sure that they are engaged with the NAACP. They can learn a set of skills that can actually manifest into a full-time career. And so part of what we do within the NAACP is make sure that our young people are trained on our policies and procedures and know how to actually move key policy priorities to the head of the association. So what I mean by that is that we have a very, very thorough resolution process where any member in good standing who's a part of a compliant unit can submit a resolution about a policy priority around key issues in all different areas and get that passed by the National Board of Directors, which is a 64-person board, to represent the policies and priorities of the NAACP. That is a really in-depth process, but we want to make sure that our young leaders also know that they have power within this association to make the issues that are most important to them priorities for the entire organization. In addition to that, we are running campaign initiatives. As I talked about, we've been working hand in hand with Young Invincibles around the student debt cancellation fight. In addition to that, we've been working around addressing gun violence in schools, addressing police brutality, addressing environmental climate justice, and a plethora of issues that are top priority for young people. And making sure that we recognize with this upcoming election, it's the issues that are going to drive young people to the polls. And so part of that is also making sure that young people understand. I really like you talked about storytelling, Satra. What we try to work on with our young people is message testing, right? And so even this last weekend, our young people participated in a listening session where they got to get to see, like, how do we develop the messaging that we use for civic engagement, which is also another career pathway for those who are interested in doing that. In addition, we're constantly making sure that they are educated on the most up-to-date research and data. They attend different public forums and conferences. And we really, really emphasize this leadership development pipeline, right? We have young people who start in our AXO programs and competing, are part of our college chapters, and move into our next gen leadership program so they can one day become branch presidents, branch leaders, and continue to fight for civil rights through the NAACP. And so part of what we're really trying to do is make sure that we have the most effective channels for young Black workers to see the broader association. In addition, we have multiple labor organizations from the National Education Association to the American Federation of Teachers who are on our board of directors. And so young people are having direct contact with the leaders of national labor unions, the AFL-CIO, all these different people who are engaging with us on a day-to-day basis. It's so important for young people to be in those rooms where those powerful decisions are being made.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There's two things that are like a common thread through both of your comments. One is like skill development and leadership development. Way too often people are invited to the table and asked to give and then step away and not actually empowered, right? Like not just empowered to speak up in the moment, but empowered to have a set of skills and experience that you can use long-term, right? Like something that like contributes to your resume and contributes to your knowledge, your skills and abilities. So I really appreciate you all, especially like highlighting this as a career. At no point during my K through 12 and likely even undergraduate experience did I like think I would be in policy or know fully what that meant. So you all are doing amazing work so that folks can prepare, right, throughout their educational timeline and their work experience for career like these. The second thing is compensation, right? So Satra mentioned that their fellows and task force members are paid. You mentioned that like all expenses are paid and any like trips. I think that's an important call out, right, for all of the nonprofits that are on this that are on this call, other advocacy orgs, but especially for funders, right? As you think about the allowable uses of funds, whether or not they're able to go to participants, whether or not they're able to compensate students for their labor, like that's an important equity clause in the ways that funders go about allowing organizations to use funding, and to pass the baton, right? Like the passing of the baton is incredibly important to sustaining democracy, to making sure that young Black workers become older Black workers and middle-aged Black workers who are just as involved, for sure. So thank you both. Back to Satra. What do you think are the top issues in federal policy facing young Black workers, and how does narrative building impact pushing those issues from ideas to laws?
Thank you for that question. And to Wisdom's point, because I'm coming from a press conference that was on student debt cancellation, it's on my mind. And so I want to start by saying, in general, we cannot discuss Black workers' financial opportunities and economic security without acknowledging the current student debt crisis and the need for urgent relief. Because what we do know from decades of research, and I mean decades, is that Black households tend to have less wealth. They also tend to have a greater number have to borrow more money to get a degree to even be able to do what we all are doing today. And then the amounts that they are borrowing are larger than those of their white counterparts. So for example, research has shown that 4 years after graduation, Black graduates owe an average of $52,000 compared to $28,000 for the white average graduate. That is unacceptable. We have to talk about this. So what I'm saying is, in sum, student loan debt is suffocating Black borrowers and preventing them from being able to achieve financial freedom. And this is why it should come as no surprise. And Kayla, don't hate me for this, but it should come as no surprise that higher education is seeing an increase in short-term credentials. And as young adults witness many generations of credentialed workers burdened by student loan debt, they're thinking of alternative ways to bypass all of the heartache and headache that we all are going to social media to share our stories about. And so I want to be clear, though, when I'm talking about short-term credentials as an increased interest, that any expansion of federal financial aid specific to short-term credentials must be accompanied with quality, robust, comprehensive guardrails, because if not, higher education will find itself in the exact predicament that it is in today. But this is exactly why storytelling and narrative building is also crucial in any policy development or movement, because you are able to hold spaces for people to share their experiences and identify gaps or missed opportunities. So we know from previous narrative building that there are institutions who are bad actors or embark upon predatory behaviors, therefore should not gain access. But it also shows that communities are able to speak truth about how these policies play out once they are implemented. And Kayla, you'll get a kick out of this because I know we've heard it time and time again in the criminal justice reform space. But something that I had learned early on in my career was that those directly impacted by policies are best suited to develop solutions, but are often, and I would say majority of the time, the furthest away from power. So as advocates, as nonprofits, as funders, you have to ask yourself, what are we doing to help build the narrative? How are we providing them with the resources that they need to change and shift some of these narratives that are outdated or deficit-based? So more than anything, the narrative building gives a platform and power to communities who have been historically oppressed to curate change. And for young adults specifically, especially Black young adults, when they share their experiences and add to the narrative shift, we connect them with those empowered, to Wisdom's point, to influence and inform their decision-making. And I will arguably say that narrative building and shifting the narrative is a crucial tool in advocacy and might be one of the most powerful.
Thank you, Satra, and thank you for always pushing me, for sure, right? So like I've been in this work, Satcher and I came into this work in like 2019 together, and have been like in constant debate around short-term credentials, around what guardrails are necessary for financial aid and specifically the Pell Grant. Like she said, we've done a lot of work around higher ed in prison and the reinstatement of the Pell Grant to folks who are currently incarcerated and learners who are currently incarcerated, and now find some of the same like arguments and like push and pull around short-term certificates. Which institutions should be allowed, what guardrails are necessary, how short is too short, how long is enough, like a number of questions that organizations I'm sure are participating are also debating. But I think again, centering the folks who are in the program, centering the learners and workers, and hearing their stories about why they want alternatives to traditional degrees and about what they want in alternatives. But I also think it's really important to center those who are working directly, right? So training providers who say, listen, there are jobs out there that I need a shorter certificate to do, that I need it to be affordable for folks to actually participate in, and that are stepping stones, right, to lifelong careers, that are stackable credentials, that are like meaningful because they move folks out of poverty, even if it's just that first step, and what that means, right? So huge thank you for all of that. And again, like thinking about what we allow to be funded and the work that we do. Narrative development work, storytelling is not quantitative data. And all too often, we're asked to only use as evidence large data sets, longitudinal studies, et cetera. But we absolutely need the support, the capacity, and the funding to be able to tell stories, to lift up qualitative data, to ask how, to do case studies, and to really dig into the real experiences for sure. So last question, and then I'm seeing some good things in the Q&A, so definitely want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. But across the country, states have adopted regressive anti-DEI laws. Coupled with last year's affirmative action ruling, there's a lot of fear around explicitly mentioning race and a lot of confusion on how to keep working on equitable causes. Wisdom, how has the NAACP responded to these changes, and what guidance can you offer to our attendees on continuing to center narratives and actions on Black workers?
Well, thank you so much, Kayla, for this question, because this is the work that I've been doing day in, day out and been thinking about because it's going to have a really big impact on this upcoming election. But something I want to highlight, like this is nothing new. I remember when I first started at the NAACP, it's my 6-year anniversary here at the association. And I remember seeing legislation starting to be passed in rural communities, literally that was to ban young people from having the NAACP on campus, having organizations that center diversity, equity, inclusion on campus. And so now that we are seeing this ramp up around the nation, right? I think even starting last summer with the gutting of affirmative action, all of us are really questioning what is next, right? How are we going to see a future in America that values all of us and not just some of us? And so some of the things that the NAACP has done, we are a policy advocacy organization, but we also litigate. And so part of what we are making sure that we are participating in is legally challenging those states that are pushing anti-DEI legislation, such as Arkansas, such as Utah, Florida. We are challenging not only in the courts, but we're also challenging the institutions. A couple months ago, we penned a letter to college athletes telling them to reconsider where to attend university based on the diversity, equity, inclusion principles of the school. And now we need to redirect those students to attend other universities that are in support of them, such as our HBCUs. Part of what we are doing is making sure that we have public awareness campaigns, such as challenging our institutions to diversity no matter what, and commitment to that, right? What does it look like to make sure that students who come from diverse backgrounds have the spaces and places to be supported when they're on campus, but also are able to be accepted into those institutions. We are looking at the different policy advocacy mechanisms. We are also building coalitions, right? A couple of weeks ago, We were on the steps of the Supreme Court with Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and the freedom to learn, and making sure that folks are understanding what is at stake, and making sure that we are part of the banner of young people who are working together to ensure that we have that freedom. We are giving different community resources to make sure folks are empowered to do grassroots organizing. And so the type of guidance that we need to offer in this moment in time for Black workers is making sure that we are using inclusive language, right? Making sure that we are thinking about equity, inclusion, underrepresented groups, making sure that it is a key focal point. As Satra talked about, highlighting the economic impact that removing diversity, equity, inclusion has, not just on institutions, but on our nation, right? We are more successful as a nation when we have diverse minds in the room, when we have diverse workers in the room, when we have people who come from a plethora of experiences to address the problems that are most pressing for today and tomorrow. Right, we have to make sure that we are documenting and sharing success stories of diversity, equity, inclusion, and how that has helped in the boardroom, in the classroom, in all aspects of Black worker life. We have to make sure that we are focusing on data and research to support the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And that's why it's super important to document that everything that we do and promote the necessary need of allyship and solidarity in this moment in time, right? We can't do this by ourselves. We need our allies to step up, to be in the room, and to speak in those places that we may not be in, right? You know, it's so wild to see the shift that has happened from 2020 to now, where there was a plethora of dollars and supporters wanting to support diversity, equity, inclusion after the murder of George Floyd, after the murder of Breonna Taylor, after the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless others that lost their lives during that summer. But 4 years later, folks are turning their back on us. And so more than ever, we have to lean into these processes. We have to lean into these systems. We have to make sure that we are leveraging our organizational influence, right? And using our name in places and spaces with trusted brands that young people and young Black workers know are going to deliver for them. Because right now, we know that young people value authenticity, right? We know they can smell when we fake the funk. They can smell when we aren't going about this the right way. And so the more authentic, the more adaptive, the more innovative we are, the more inclusive we will be, and in making sure that we are setting up the right defenses when these attacks are happening across the nation.
And I just want to double down on something that Wisdom said in terms of just like coalition building and just this cross-sector collaboration. I cannot emphasize that enough. Wisdom and I are founders of a National Student Debt Coalition, and the great things we have been able to do have been in community. There is power in people, and in this current climate, I just cannot stress that enough. We cannot do it alone, and it doesn't matter if you're in workforce, if you're in higher ed, if you're environmental justice, it all is, it crosses. It's intersectional. These issues are intersectional because it is very much systemic, and so really just wanted to double down on that, especially since we have so many folks in the room. It's going to take a community effort to really address a lot of these injustices.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Right. I think, Wisdom, you said like now's not the time to abandon us, or it was right. Like that's real, right? Like this is abandonment. This is stepping away from your promises, from commitments that were made not long ago, right? Like I think a lot of the language around affirmative action last year was like, we haven't even seen a full generation, right? Like of what letting the affirmative action policies play out. But in terms of DEI, we haven't even seen a full 5 years, right? And that is particularly important to say, like, we remember, we were there, we were all at home listening. There was nothing else to do, and cheering and rooting these folks on. And I think it's like not just folks like us who are in this work all the time. It's absolutely the employee associations at private employers that have to consider, like have to continuously like center employee worker groups for people of color, right? And feel safe enough to do so. So how do corporate environments or small businesses actually like create cultures where that's allowed, right? And where people are safe and can center DEI and bring up issues that they're facing as Black workers, young Black workers especially. And so it's not just the nonprofits, the advocacy groups, the think tanks, it's the corporate employers that made a lot of commitments also. It's the higher education institutions that made a lot of commitments also. And that's why like the question was around like the decision and the laws, but also the fear, right? Because I think there's a lot of fear mongering, there's a lot of interpretation, and there's a lot of not wanting to attract attention, which is fair, but staying committed and fulfilling those promises because we know that's what's good. We've seen like what the progress that has been made when we are affirmative in our action, when we like are committed and act upon it, when we do what is right, to level the playing field and to be equitable. We've seen what happens, so we know what will happen when we withdraw, right? So thank you both for participating. We will move to Q&A. Welcome back on some of the other folks as we answer a few questions, and feel free, we have plenty of time if anyone else wants to drop a few in. First question is around the scope of today's webinar around messaging, and would love to understand about the intended audiences for the 13 messaging principles that the Joint Center is amplifying. So I think we've kind of gotten to it as Wisdom, Satra, and I were speaking. This is for anyone doing work around Black workers. I think messaging is not just for communications, media engagement, publications. Messaging is also internal. How do you talk about? If you employ young Black workers, how do you speak about them? How do you speak to them? How do these narratives show up in your internal policies, practices, and procedures, right? What are you doing to make sure that you're living out some of those messaging principles in your operations, in your culture, in the work that you're doing, right? So this is for employers of young Black workers. This is for advocates who are doing work on labor and need to be considerate of both folks who are young and Black. This is for Black organizations like the Joint Center and NAACP. This is for youth organizations like Young Invincibles and others on this call. This is for funders who are doing work around racial justice, who are doing work around labor and workforce development, who are doing work around youth, right? If you are at all concerned with anything around youth, labor, or racial justice, these messaging elements can absolutely be utilized in your external engagements, but also your internal processes. Happy to follow up if you have a follow-up question, for sure. All right, so someone says, this is beautiful, thank you. So any consideration of framing a narrative around young Black laborers as investors? Many at a very young age own community-based businesses, are part of the gig economy, and are retail investors in the stock market, all while laboring and working. It feels like there's a wealth accumulation and capital formation storyline to tell to counter the negative or complement the limited perspective. Good question. I might point that towards Diedrich, who can weigh in on the racial wealth gap and how young Black workers can be centered not just as workers, but investors, and what organizations need to do to build that narrative.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I think I would have thought more so first as young, and this was already discussed earlier on, young Black workers as assets, right? And two, I do think oftentimes and I have a lot of experience in focusing on racial wealth inequality, that people separate the idea of income and work from developing wealth, right? The way most of us will develop wealth is through work, right? And it's through our early, years in the workforce. So I do think it is, I'm shifting the question a little bit, it is essential that we recognize that part of the narrative around addressing the issues of young Black workers is that, they themselves are assets, and that this career path we're putting them on is one that will allow them to, build wealth, develop wealth for themselves, for future generations, and, is part of the answer of addressing the racial wealth divide. I think, and as investors, it's clearly it is also through the wealth that we gain from work that we're able to take the next steps in investment, whether it's home ownership, whether it's financial investment, these types of things. So I think really locating Black workforce as part of this wealth and asset development train that we need to move much farther is essential.
And Kayla, can I add to that as well? One of the things I have learned, especially in the student debt conversation, and it's to the latter point of the comment where it says countering the narrative. I found that, and this will not be surprised to you all, the corporations, they own sometimes the media. They control the narrative. And what we have tried to do is mobilizing people not only to inform them about what is the narrative that people are portraying about whatever the topic is, so this Black investors, and what are some of the deficit-based or inaccuracies in this story that they're telling of this certain topic, and what do we need to be able to counter it. And so sometimes it is to I want to say, you said this in terms of communications, like how are we thinking strategically, and even as a coalition, to like combat and get in front of some of the ways that hinder the progress that we're trying to make. And it's easier said than done, but I do think there is something to be said about just strategic communications and just ways that you can counter the narrative by using the stories of those who are impacted to inform it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And like the question brought up the gig economy and like investment and stock market. And I think this has been like, as folks, Black workers, Black learners specifically, have been struggling with student debt, medical debt, like wanting to generate generational wealth, right? Like wanting to like do like, Black folks break generational curses, right? Like wanting to like establish ourselves, wanting and learning a bit more. I think social media has played a huge role, right? In like LLCs, investing, crypto, like there are a lot of new terms going around over the last 5 years or so around money that many of us were not exposed to before. And I agree with the question that there's a thread here around like young Black folks, but Black folks at large as investors, and what we can do to be really clear about like what's possible for the money that we are making through working. Absolutely a great question. There was a question around whether or not the slides and messaging narratives will be available. Absolutely. You should already have some information in your inbox, but we are recording this webinar and we'll absolutely send out all of the slides and information. We have actually a longer slide deck with even more information, but we'll make sure that one gets to you. Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Next question. What is the biggest problematic narrative that has hindered Black people in breaking into generational wealth? Would love for one of our task force members to weigh in there.
Well, it's hard. It's hard to pick one. But I say that we're not real. I would say two examples that we're not real, right? Over long periods. I think that's a narrative that's been on a lot of people, especially when it comes to building wealth. And then also, I would say that oftentimes advocating for ourselves, I think there's a narrative around when we advocate for ourselves in the workplace or in institutions that are serving us or that we are working in. It's oftentimes always met with conflict and always put in that lens, right? Rather than, our advocacy for ourselves is often seen as destructive rather than constructive. So we kind of get labeled that when we're advocating for ourselves for better spaces and for more equitable spaces, a lot of times the narrative is we're trying to tear down these already established spaces, but in all actuality, we're really trying to grow them and make them equitable for all, right? And you see this with a lot of narratives, right? When you talk about teaching Black history, right? Or when you talk about taking Confederate names off of schools, which, when a school actually put their names back, a county put their names back on two schools, right? The big narrative, like especially with the DEI backlash or quote unquote critical race, that it's a situation where us just mainly advocating for a better society that we have a right to advocate for is seen as us being in conflict with the society that is.
Thanks so much. Sierra or Justin, what is the biggest problematic narrative that has hindered Black workers in the breaking into of generational wealth?
I can share. I believe the main concern is lack of education for sure. We're often not educated on, how to retain money, keep money within our families, and build it and to grow into something more. And I think that comes from the lack of education and also We have been conditioned to survive, and we don't necessarily always think about our futures in our communities. And I think that also prevents us from thinking about long-term goals for our children and what our legacy will be. And so that can also hinder it. And I also think just in the Black community in general, just wanting those things for ourselves, sometimes within our own communities, we can be very content. And so because of that, we don't want to educate ourselves, or we don't know the resources or avenues to go about getting that information to figure that out. I'm still learning that within my own family as well, just figuring that out. And I definitely think that my generation is learning the importance of financial literacy and economic development. And so I'm hoping with my generation, we'll be able to break that cycle and start a new foundation. But I definitely think the lack of education is probably the biggest hindrance in Black people and generational wealth.
Yeah, and I think since the question is around like problematic narratives, right? The difference between formalized education and like financial literacy in education, right? Because many of us have degrees, many of us have careers, but perhaps haven't had the type of like exposure to
It
Oh, I
looks
think we
like
got frozen up.
Kayla is frozen, so I can pick up until she gets back on. I would say the narrative that we're unqualified, right? That I feel like it has been a big hindrance, because what happens is we go out, get more credentials, more certificates, more degrees. We put ourselves into more debts in order to the focus group talked a little bit about this. We put ourselves in more debt. We spend more money to get these credentials and letters next to our name, but we end up not making the same salaries of those who are other races who are less qualified. We have this mounting debt from going to get those credentials and degrees, certificates, when if the narrative was different, we wouldn't have to go so far. But that's been our history, right? To have to be accumulate everything we need just to get our foot in the door, right? Like that's been a big hindrance. I see it. My family, myself, colleagues, like we just have to continue to build and build our background and our credentials in order to even get our foot in some of these entry level roles and low paying positions. So for me, I think that's one of the biggest hindrances, that we're unqualified when we are truly enough and we are truly qualified.
Thanks, Justin. Sorry about that. I was just talking. I was just talking like, yeah. But I think I was just making a point. I think Justin really finished it out really well around like the difference between the lack of formalized education and like access to and awareness of financial tools, right? So like that different like conversation around investment can be something that folks across income levels, education levels, and other socioeconomic levels can have different exposure to, for sure. Thank you for that question. We have two more. What impact does mental health play in employment and wealth building in the Black community? How do we approach our trauma response to economics? Great question. I might kick that to Satra. I know she's been doing quite a bit of work on mental health and young folks.
Yes, this is a good question. I don't know if you saw my face. I took a step back and I said, wow, that is something we need to bridge into our work. I will say our work is primarily focused on providing resources to young adults while they're on college campuses, but also making sure that health insurance counts mental health services as preventive health to cut down the cost. It made me think of this question. Also made me think of the work of Stephon Crawford at the Hip Hop Caucus, who is really trying to, I don't even want to say destigmatize, but really address the trauma that Black communities face, unfortunately, when it comes to this topic. And I think you have to begin by having the conversation. So one of the things that we learned when we were first building out our mental health portfolio is that we have to destigmatize mental health. Many communities of color don't even want to talk about it, don't even want to access resources because of the different stigmas or stories that they have been told growing up. I know for myself, when I went to therapy for various reasons, I was told to just pray about it. And so I think as a community, we have to hold space for one another and to be honest about some of the ways these systems, unfortunately, have put us in unfortunate situations, but really getting to the root of why we are even having this trauma, or why we have bared this trauma or carried on this trauma. But I think we first have to begin in general, but just by having space and having these conversations and then developing solutions to mitigate. But anyone else want to chime in? That's a great question.
Something I would like to add as well is oftentimes when it comes to what really affects mental health in the workplace is the times when Black workers and employees are talking about their issues, but they're getting ignored, or they're being told that the issues they're talking about don't matter, or that they misinterpreted, right? So that lack of community response and community validation when a member of the community is talking about harm, is talking about neglect. I think that contributes a lot to the mental health issues because, you have people even, it's one thing to get to the point where you're talking about these narratives and talking about these situations, but it's another thing when they're getting ignored.
Okay. Thank you, Evan. And thank you, Satra, for sure. I think there's just been a lot more of a conversation that I'm glad has actually translated, not just into resources like directories, but also into conversations. I'm thinking about Taraji and her centering of Black mental health and her congressional testimony, like a real conversation and a real narrative shift, right, around this being an acceptable resource, an acceptable solution to seek out alongside some of the more traditional religious supports that Black workers and Black folks have sought out. So thank you both for sure. So 2 more questions, and got another one. So 3 more questions. Thanks for the guidance this morning, and wondering if the development of messaging principles can be used to discuss the importance of quality in training and early career opportunities, because in the Inquirer's experience, a lot of the training and education opportunities offered to young Black workers are often underbaked. And there's a pervasive attitude among employers that even though they are underbaked, that young Black workers should somehow still be grateful for those for these opportunities. And from the perspective of messaging, how can we share language to flip this dynamic? I think you've done it, right? Like in the question itself, like questioning the equity and allowing and what message we are sending to participants by giving them subpar experiences, by not compensating them for their labor, by not building out meaningful experiences that lead to jobs and skill development and career development, right? So the narrative that young Black workers should be grateful for something substandard means that that's the standard you're setting for them, right? And that is inherently racist. And I think it's okay to call that out. And if any others want to weigh in.
Yeah, I would just add, like you're seeing that the responses in real time, right? Gen Z and millennials are saying enough is enough, right? Like if you are not respecting them, if you're not compensating them properly, they don't want to move up in your company. They don't want to take on managerial positions. They don't want to move in those spaces if you're not going to give them the respect that they deserve. And so if you're thinking about the future of a corporation, of a company, the sustainability even of our nonprofit organizations, right? We really have to do a whole assessment about how we are bringing new people, young Black workers into this space.
Definitely. So somewhat related question around the Colorado Consumer Health Initiative did a community board on the medical trauma that the Black community has from our past. Do any of us believe that this intersects with Black workers with health conditions not being perceived well in the community as a whole? Yeah, I think that is important, right? And something that like our narrative messaging elements really centered on young Black workers and not like in their identities, both in terms of youth and race, and not the intersectionality of a number of other factors that absolutely impact their employment, whether that is like health and medical conditions, gender, sexuality, and others, and the ways that they present in the workforce, but also the ways that they're allowed to participate in the workforce. I think one of the things that has been incredibly important and that we've seen millennials and Gen Z really talk about, even within this work, is remote work and how that allowed them to be safe from experiencing microaggressions in the workplace, safe from the stress of commuting, the costs of additional childcare, the costs of commuting, the costs of lunch and attire, and all the different things that go into in-person work. And we've seen that in both this work, in our messaging principles, but also in others' work over the last few years in the transition to remote and hybrid work over the last 4 years. However, I remember a conversation in 2020 from a lot of folks who advocate for disability rights and accessibility to work, saying this is what we've been asking for decades. For decades, we've needed it to be successful in the workforce, and only when it was necessary for everyone to have it, have we actually gotten it in ways that allow us to participate in the workforce in meaningful ways, right? So for young Black workers with health conditions, with disabilities, I think this brings out even more true that like we've now seen organizations move out of necessity in 2020, but also just out of growth and progress into more flexible working environments that allow folks with disabilities to have more flexible time, to work from home, to have what they need for an adequate office setup. I think that's super important. And we've seen young folks say that that's important to them in the workplace also. We've got time for probably one or two more that we have in here. And there are companies where many of us may work that refuse to change their systems and processes that ultimately yield disproportionate and unfavorable results and outcomes for Black employees, whether that's in hiring, promotion, advancement, and retention. Should we continue to support these companies with our energy and talent? We got a nod from Evan, so I'll see if he wants to weigh in or kick it to Justin or Wisdom. Should we continue to support these companies with our energy and talent? I think I'm definitely interested in what Wisdom has to say, considering we've explicitly told students not to support institutions that are doing things like this. So does that apply to workers and employers as well? But go ahead, Evan.
I would say, yeah, I think institutions can be bad, but then I think when we talk about the market that we're in, right, finding an institution that reflects all of our values is going to be hard, right? So I think keeping it on the material and keeping it on the workers, I think helps, because I think the way you're going to change these institutions is through the key stakeholders, which are the workers, right? So like things like unionization, as we talked about before, collective action, collective support. I think if we bring the communities in and actually support the people and have clear messaging and have clear strategy, I think that could be a way to bridging the gap and then actually identifying these issues and answering them.
Yep, no, definitely agree with Evan. I know it's a really tough job market right now, and folks are struggling to find work, and people still have to provide for their families, and young Black people are facing higher burdens than ever. I was just reading the other day that Gen Z has the most credit card debt in comparison to past generations, right? And so I think it's important for us to also call the question to these organizations, to these companies, to these corporations in terms of how they are actually supporting diversity, equity, inclusion. I think one thing that I believe through organizing is that we have to call that question every single time to ensure that they respect us and have these spaces necessary to foster our development, right? Yes, yeah, we can withhold our talent from these organizations and create our own organization or go to organizations that support us. But a lot of these companies have a lot of power, not just locally, not on the state level, nationally and globally, right? And so this is not just impacting young Black workers in America, but young Black workers across the diaspora, right? And so it's really important for us as people who may be in these rooms, may be in these places and spaces, to consistently call the question on how they are centering those who come from our community. And so part of it is that there are going to be people who are going to have to be in that space, in those boardrooms, and say enough is enough. And say, you know, this boardroom isn't reflective of the communities that we claim that we support, of the commitments that we have said time and time again of diversity, equity, inclusion. It can't just be for optics. It can't be just because folks wanted their stores not to be broken into in 2020. There has to be real community investment. There has to be real change in the corporate executive rooms, and it has to be felt all the way from the top to the bottom.
I think that's a great point around like we have to provide for ourselves and our families, right? In this economy that typically means work, right? And so it's for those of us who have privilege to, it is a privilege, right? To be able to like withhold your labor from certain places or to not attend certain institutions, right? Or to not patronize certain businesses. But I do think there's something we all can do and the personal choice to say like, this is my money, this is my time, this is my energy, this is my labor, this is my vote. Like all of these things are power. And here are the ways I'm using them to like impact racial equity for Black folks, right? Whether that means I'm trying to buy from more Black businesses, trying to work for places that actually center racial justice, or whether that means I'm working on the inside to change places that aren't, right? Like there's different ways for us to engage. I think we probably have time for one more. And that's our last one around what should be the collective response for young Black workers to the current attacks on DEI? So what should young Black workers be doing?
Well, I would say building community, right? I think that, you know, when everybody's against us, it's the best time for us to be together. And I think that that's a super important part because I think the reason why these attacks have been so effective is because our communities, in many cases, even after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, are very segmented, right? And the resources continue to build that gap, right? So I think, you know, and if we're able to actually build these systems and support them on a consistent basis over time, we'd be able to build a baseline that we can leverage for change. So I would just say that very quickly, you know, their collective response should be get informed, know what's out there and know how we can support it, and then actually showing up when our fellow community members need support.
All right. Any last answers before we transition out?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think it's we have to develop our networks, right? Know where the places and spaces that are safe for us to work, to be supported, to be developed at. We have to, as Satra shared, share our stories, share our personal narratives, and let people know how this is impacting us. And most importantly, we got to vote, right? This is on the ballot. This is on the election. You know, we have to make sure we're identifying the elected officials that are in support of diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace, and ensure that those people are at the forefront of those movements. For us not engaging in that process, there's a lot at stake. And so we have to make sure that we turn up and turn out and keep these people accountable 365 days of the year.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all so much to each of my fellow panelists for speaking with us today. I want to thank all of you who joined us today for this important discussion on improving policy narratives for young Black workers. Please visit our webpage, which we're dropping in the chat. The webpage features vignettes and photos of our task force members like Sierra and Wayne. The full deck, PDF with the messaging elements and the press release. If the media has any follow-up questions, please direct them to our Vice President of Communications, Chandra Hazlett, which we're also dropping in the chat as well. Thank you all for being with us today.